The city streets were cold and unforgiving that evening. A thin wind whispered through the alleyways, carrying the distant sounds of car horns, footsteps, and the faint laughter of people hurrying home. Among the shadows, a young man walked slowly, his coat worn and his shoes scuffed, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. His eyes, however, were different. They were bright, alert, and full of a quiet intensity, as if he were always searching, always listening to something the rest of the world could not hear. He had walked these streets countless times before. He knew where the streetlights flickered, where the stray cats liked to hide, and which corners offered the warmest patches of heat from the old coffee shop vents. Tonight, like every night, he carried with him the same small hope, something he never let go of, even when the world seemed harsh and unforgiving. That hope lived inside him, quiet and persistent, the same way his music had always lived inside him. The young man had been playing the piano for as long as he could remember. His fingers seemed to have a mind of their own, moving across imaginary keys as he walked, tapping rhythms against the edge of a bench or the side of a lamppost. He remembered the first piano he ever touched, an old upright in a dusty room of a small community center. It had been out of tune, the wood scratched and the pedals barely functional, yet the sound that came from it felt like magic. Ever since that moment he had carried the music inside him, but life had not been kind. His family had struggled, and after they passed away, the streets became his home. Food was scarce, and each day was a challenge to survive. Yet through it all he never gave up on music. People sometimes noticed him humming softly on street corners or tapping out a rhythm on the edge of a doorway. Some smiled and tossed a coin, while others ignored him completely. But he never played for attention, never played for money. He played because he had to, because the music was a part of him, and without it, the world felt empty. That evening, the young man wandered further than usual, drawn by the sound of something different. Through the foggy windows of a grand building, he could see the warm glow of chandeliers and hear the faint notes of a piano drifting through the hall. Curiosity stirred in him, along with the familiar pang of hunger. He paused outside the entrance, peering in. The room inside was filled with people dressed in fine clothes, their laughter and chatter mixing with the soft music. Waiters moved gracefully among the tables, carrying trays of food that smelled rich and inviting. He took a deep breath, his stomach tightening at the sight of the feast before him. He had learned to survive on scraps, and the idea of a full meal made his mouth water. But more than that, he was drawn by the piano. He could feel it calling him, as if it recognized him, as if it had been waiting for someone like him all along. He stepped closer, his eyes tracing the elegant instrument sitting in the center of the room, and he felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. He was not sure anyone would even notice him if he tried to play. The young man hesitated at the threshold. He had never entered a place like this before. The polished floors, the sparkling glasses, the crystal chandeliers, they all seemed like a different world. People would laugh at him if they knew how ragged he looked. Yet he could not turn away. Something inside him whispered that this was his moment. He had played in streets, in empty halls, in dusty rooms, but never in a place like this. And somehow he knew that if he wanted to survive the night, he might have to take a risk. He walked slowly toward the piano, his footsteps quiet but deliberate. He could feel the eyes of a few curious onlookers on him, their expressions a mix of amusement and disbelief. A waiter approached, frowning at the sight of him. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked, his tone polite but cautious. The young man looked up at him, his voice barely a whisper. I can play," he said. "For just one meal." The waiter blinked, caught off guard. "Just one meal?" he repeated, unsure if he had heard correctly. The young man nodded. "I won't ask for more. I just want to play, please." His eyes were steady, calm, and filled with a quiet confidence that made the waiter pause. Something about him seemed different. He didn't look like someone begging or trying to cheat the system. He looked like someone who had a gift, and maybe, just maybe, that gift deserved a chance. The waiter hesitated, glancing around the room. Some of the guests had noticed the exchange and were now watching with curiosity. A few snickers floated through the air, people whispering about the boy in rags, daring to ask for such a thing in their fancy restaurant. but the music called louder than the judgment. With a reluctant nod, the waiter stepped aside. "Fine," he said. "You may play, but just for a moment." The young man nodded gratefully, a small smile forming on his lips. He approached the piano, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. The room fell silent, the chatter and laughter fading as people sensed something unusual was about to happen. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and let his fingers find the keys. The first notes were soft, tentative, almost fragile. Yet even in their quietness, there was a beauty that caught the attention of everyone in the room. The music was not just notes, it was emotion, memory, longing, and hope all wrapped into one. The young man closed his eyes and let the music flow through him. Each movement of his fingers telling a story words could never express. People began to lean forward in their chairs, drawn to the sound they had not expected. The soft, almost hesitant beginning gave way to something richer, more confident. The young man did not play for applause or approval. He played because he had to. He played because the piano had always been his companion, his friend, and his voice. And as he played, the room began to change. The laughter and chatter disappeared completely, replaced by an almost reverent silence. Every eye was on him, every ear straining to catch the next note, the next melody. It was as if time itself had slowed. People forgot the food on their plates, the conversations they had been having, even the reason they had come to this place. They were not watching a boy in rags anymore, they were watching a musician, an artist, someone whose gift was undeniable and raw. Some leaned back, mouths slightly open, trying to process what they were hearing. Others sat forward, unable to tear their eyes away. The music filled every corner of the room, weaving through the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. And in the middle of it all, the young man remained humble, focused entirely on the piano. His eyes moved from the keys to the audience only once, and in that brief moment there was a spark of connection. The room seemed to recognize something profound. This was not just skill. This was genius. Every note, every chord, carried a weight and emotion far beyond his years. When the music finally faded, there was a moment of silence so deep it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Then came the whispers, soft, amazed, incredulous. People exchanged glances, trying to find words to describe what they had just witnessed. Some were teary-eyed, others simply stunned. The young man opened his eyes and looked around, but he did not say a word. The only sound was his own breathing and the faint echo of the last note lingering in the air. The waiter stepped forward, holding a plate of food. "Here," he said, still uncertain, still in awe. "For you?" As promised. The young man smiled softly, not out of triumph or pride, but gratitude. He had come seeking only a meal, yet in that moment, something else had been given to him, a recognition, a respect, and the understanding that his music could touch hearts. Even in the most unlikely of places, he sat down and ate quietly, savoring the simple meal as the room slowly returned to life around him. But the impression he had left would not fade. People would talk about this night for a long time. They had seen something rare, something extraordinary. And for the young man, it was just another step on a journey that had begun in silence, on a broken piano in a dusty room, and now had led him to a place where the world could finally hear him. That night, as he finished his meal and left the warmth of the restaurant, the streets felt different. The cold air still bit at his cheeks, but there was a lightness in his step. He had asked for only one meal, but he had given the world a glimpse of something unforgettable. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this was only the beginning. The young man left the restaurant that night with a feeling he had never felt before. The city streets still bit with cold, and the wind still carried its usual bite, but something in him had shifted. The meal he had received was simple, modest even, yet it had been a symbol of recognition. He realized, as he walked, that what he had done was more than play for food. It was a moment where the world had paused and truly listened. The next morning, the city woke in its usual chaos. People rushed to work, markets bustled, and street vendors called out their goods. The young man wandered through the familiar streets, his hands in his pockets, his coat pulled tight around him. But unlike other days, he felt lighter. He carried with him a secret, a memory from the night before that gave him warmth no winter wind could take away. As he moved through the streets, he could feel the eyes of strangers occasionally turning toward him. Some looked curious, others indifferent. He had learned long ago to ignore the stares, the whispers, the judgments. But something about yesterday's music had changed the way he felt. Even the pigeons on the square seemed to notice him differently, cooing and fluttering as if in approval. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in a world where he had learned to survive unnoticed, it felt enormous. By mid-morning, hunger had started to return, sharper than before. But he did not panic. He had survived days like this. Still, the memory of the warm meal from the night before lingered, and he thought about how he might earn something today, not for himself alone, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing he could still make the world stop for a moment. He wandered toward a small park where an old, slightly broken piano had been placed by the city council. No one usually played it. Children ran past, laughing and kicking up fallen leaves, and elderly men sat on benches, watching the world go by. He approached the piano, brushing off a thin layer of dust with his coat sleeve. The keys were yellowed, some slightly chipped, but the instrument called to him nonetheless. He placed his fingers on the keys and let them fall, one after the other, testing the sound. Even with its imperfections, the piano responded. He closed his eyes and let his hands move, letting the music flow naturally. He did not play for anyone in particular. In fact, he hoped no one would notice. It was enough to simply play, to let the sound escape into the air, to fill the space with something beautiful and human. But fate had a way of intervening. A small crowd began to gather, curious at the soft, unusual music drifting through the park. At first they watched cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Some whispered to each other, commenting on the boy in worn clothes sitting before the broken piano. Others were captivated, drawn to the purity of the music. It was not loud or showy, but it was honest and moving, carrying with it a depth of feeling that seemed far beyond the young man's age. Among the crowd, there was a man in a tailored coat, his face sharp and alert, who paused and listened. He was a music enthusiast, someone who had spent years attending concerts, listening to accomplished performers and seeking talent that spoke not just of skill but of heart. Something about the young man's playing struck him immediately. There was passion here, yes, but also precision, control, and an understanding of the keys that could only come from years of dedication. He leaned in slightly, trying to catch every note, his eyes widening as the music reached its quiet, intricate climax. The crowd began to murmur, and some people stepped closer, entranced. The young man opened his eyes slowly, noticing the growing audience. He felt a familiar flutter of nerves, but it was tempered by something stronger, confidence born of years of practice, of playing in empty rooms and silent streets. He let the music carry him, and as he did, the whispers grew into audible admiration. People began to recognize that they were witnessing something rare. A young woman, standing near a fountain, whispered to the person beside her, "I've never heard anything like this. He's amazing." Others nodded, unable to find words, their faces reflecting awe and surprise. For the young man, it was unusual to receive such attention. He was used to passing unnoticed, used to the world moving on without paying him any mind. Yet today, the music had given him a voice louder than any shout, a presence that could not be ignored. As the notes poured from his fingers, he became aware of his surroundings in a new way. He noticed the way the sunlight glinted off the fountain, how the leaves on the trees shimmered in the wind, and how every face in the crowd seemed frozen, caught in a shared moment of wonder. Music had always been a private thing for him, a companion in the silence of his life, but now it had become a bridge. He realized that even the most brief encounter could touch hearts. Even if only for a moment. After finishing a particularly intricate passage, he paused and let the final note linger. Silence followed, heavy and profound, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Then, slowly, applause began to rise, timid at first, then swelling into genuine admiration. The young man looked up, slightly startled. He had not expected this. He had played for himself, for the music, not for recognition or praise. Yet here it was, flowing toward him from the crowd. Warm and sincere, the man in the tailored coat stepped forward, his eyes shining with excitement. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what you have? This is not just talent, it's genius." The young man looked at him, unsure of what to say. Words were not his strong suit. Music was his language. He shook his head slightly, almost shyly, and said, I just play." The man smiled, sensing humility beneath the confidence of the performance. "Yes, but it is more than just playing. You have something rare, something that can change lives, not just for you, but for everyone who hears it. You should not keep it hidden." The young man absorbed the words quietly, letting them settle. Recognition was unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Yet there was also a thrill in knowing that someone saw what he had always known, that his music mattered. As the crowd began to disperse, the young man packed up, brushing his hands against his coat to remove the dust of the piano. He felt a strange mix of pride and modesty, of hope and caution. The city continued around him, oblivious to the transformation that had just occurred in a quiet corner of the park. Yet he knew that something had changed, that his life was moving along a new path, one that he had never dared to imagine. Later that day he wandered toward a small cafe, thinking about the conversation with the man in the coat. Inside, the warmth was comforting, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee made his stomach rumble. He found a quiet corner and sat down, his thoughts still buzzing from the morning's events. He replayed the music in his mind, the notes and melodies flowing like a river, and realized that for the first time in a long while, he felt seen. As he ate, he thought about the people who had watched him play. Their surprise, their awe, their genuine admiration, it was something he had never experienced on such a scale. The idea that his music could reach beyond himself, touch strangers, and leave an impression was both humbling and thrilling. It made him wonder how many other doors might open if he allowed himself to be seen more often. Outside, the city moved on. Life carried its usual rhythm, indifferent to the small, extraordinary moments that had taken place. But inside the young man, a quiet fire burned. He realized that the music that had always been his companion was also a bridge, a way to connect with the world. And perhaps, he thought, if he followed it, he could find more than just survival. He could find purpose, recognition, maybe even belonging. By evening, he returned to the streets he knew so well. The wind had picked up again, and the city lights reflected off wet pavements from an earlier drizzle. Yet he felt a calmness within, a quiet certainty that something was changing. The day had begun like any other, with hunger and uncertainty, but it had ended with hope. And for someone who had long been invisible, that hope was a treasure beyond measure. As he walked, he kept thinking about the man in the coat and the words he had spoken. The idea of his music changing lives, not just his own, was a thought he could not shake. He realized that perhaps he had been too cautious, too shy, and that the world might be ready to hear what he had to offer. And though he had only played for himself and a few strangers in a park, it was enough to set in motion something new. Something that could not be undone. He paused for a moment on a bridge overlooking the river, the water glinting in the evening light. The sounds of the city were distant, softened by the flow of the river. He thought about the night before, the warm meal, and the music that had carried him through. And he realized that he was ready to take another step, however uncertain it might be. The piano had called him before, and it would call again. He only had to listen. With a final glance at the lights reflecting on the water, he continued walking. His path was unknown, filled with possibilities and risks, but he no longer feared it. Music was his guide, and through it he could navigate the world with a purpose he had never imagined. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the city, as people carried on with their lives, a young man in worn clothes dreamed of the melodies yet to come, knowing that the next time he played, the world might stop once more to listen. The days after the park performance passed in a blur for the young man. Life on the streets remained difficult, but something had changed inside him. There was a lightness in his step, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He no longer felt completely invisible, no longer like just another face among the thousands in the city. People had listened. People had cared, even if only for a moment. And that was enough to make him dream. He wandered the streets as usual, his eyes scanning for opportunities, but now with a new awareness. He noticed the little things, the way the city sounds could blend like music, how the sunlight hitting a puddle made a rhythm of shadows and reflections, even how the footsteps of passers-by could mimic a beat if he listened closely. His mind was alive with music everywhere he looked, and he could feel it pulling him forward. One morning, as he sat near a fountain, carefully practicing melodies in his mind while tapping rhythms on the stone edge, he was approached by a young man in plain but neat clothing. He seemed polite, respectful, and carried an air of calm confidence. "I heard you the other day," he said softly. "In the park, you're remarkable." The young man looked up, startled, unsure if he had heard correctly. I just play," he replied almost shyly. "No," the visitor insisted gently. "You don't just play. You inspire. You make people feel. There's a kind of magic in your music that is rare. I work with music programs for talented young people, and I think you belong somewhere that can see and nurture your talent." The offer surprised him. He had always played for survival, for the quiet joy it gave him, never expecting recognition or guidance. Yet something in the stranger's voice made him pause. He had learned to trust the music first, but maybe, he realized, he could trust people too. Not everyone, of course, but sometimes a door opened at exactly the right moment. For the next few days, the young man thought long and hard about the offer. He wandered the streets, the wind biting at his cheeks, his stomach growling with hunger, but his mind racing with possibilities. A part of him feared that this could be another trap, that the world would take his talent without giving anything in return. Yet another part of him felt a rare excitement, a thrill he had not experienced in years. The idea of playing for more than coins tossed on the street, of being recognized for who he was intoxicating. Eventually he accepted. Not with words at first, but with a quiet determination. He followed the stranger to a small building tucked in a quieter part of the city. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. There were instruments of all kinds, from pianos to violins, and even sheet music scattered across tables and stands. The young man's eyes widened. This was a world he had only imagined in fragments, in dreams whispered to himself on cold nights. He was introduced to a mentor, a gentle, kind-eyed teacher who immediately understood him. "You don't need to prove anything to me," the teacher said, smiling. "I want to help you grow, to let the music inside you reach the world. But you must promise to keep listening, to keep feeling, and never lose the heart that makes your music special." The young man nodded, feeling both nervous and excited. The idea of being taught, of having guidance, was new to him. He had always relied on instinct, practice in silence, and the quiet observation of the world. Now he would have someone to guide him, someone to challenge him to reach beyond what he thought possible. The first lessons were both thrilling and frustrating. The mentor was patient but firm, pointing out technical mistakes the young man had never noticed in his self-taught playing. "You play with your heart, yes," the mentor said, "but your fingers must also speak clearly. Every note must have intention. Every pause must breathe." At first, the young man struggled. He had never considered the theory, the mechanics, or the discipline that came with formal training. But he persisted, his fingers learning to obey his mind as much as his heart. Weeks passed. Each day he arrived early and left late, practicing relentlessly. He still walked the streets, still experienced hunger and discomfort, but his music had begun to transform. It was no longer just instinct. It was a combination of raw talent and cultivated skill. His melodies gained layers, depth, and emotion that even he sometimes could not anticipate. People began to notice him again in public spaces, lingering near the training building to catch a note, a chord, a glimpse of the young man who seemed to carry both struggle and brilliance in his music. One afternoon, as the young man practiced a particularly challenging piece, a small group of listeners gathered outside the window. They whispered among themselves, amazed by what they heard. Some were children, their eyes wide with wonder, Others were adults who had seen countless performances and yet had never encountered anyone like him. The young man felt a mixture of pride and humility, a quiet satisfaction that his music could touch hearts. Even before he had reached an audience officially, but not everything was easy. The young man faced moments of doubt and exhaustion. Some days, his fingers refused to cooperate and frustration gnawed at him. The mentor would watch silently, offering guidance, encouragement, or a gentle push. "Your talent is a gift," the teacher said one evening, "but gifts are only as strong as the work behind them. You must fight through the moments when you think you cannot, when every note feels wrong. That is where greatness begins." And so he fought. He stayed late into the night, practicing until his fingers ached and his body begged for rest. He learned to read sheet music, to play with precision, and to bring emotion to every phrase. Slowly, he began to understand that his music was not just for survival. Not just for himself, it could tell stories, share feelings, and connect with people in ways words could never reach. One evening, after months of intense training, the mentor invited him to perform in a small recital for local patrons and music lovers. It was the first time the young man would play for an audience beyond the park or the restaurant, and he felt a mixture of fear and excitement. The hall was modest but elegant, the seats polished, the lights warm. People chatted quietly, unaware of the talent about to grace the stage. When he stepped forward, a hush fell over the room. The young man's hands trembled slightly, but he remembered the lessons, the hours of practice, and the music that had always been inside him. He closed his eyes and let the first notes flow. The sound was delicate yet confident, each key pressed with intention, each pause measured and meaningful. The audience was captivated, leaning forward, holding their breath as the music filled the hall. As he continued, the young man began to lose himself in the melodies. The room seemed to disappear, replaced by a world made of sound, rhythm, and feeling. Every chord told a story, every phrase painted a picture. And when he finished, the silence that followed was so profound it seemed almost sacred. Then came the applause, slow at first, then growing, swelling into genuine admiration. People approached him afterward, their eyes shining, praising not just his skill but the emotion he conveyed. The young man felt a warmth he had never known, a recognition that went far beyond food or coins. For the first time, he realized that his music could create connections, evoke emotions, and leave an imprint on people's hearts. It was a power he had always had, but had only just begun to understand. As he walked home that night, he felt lighter than he had in years. The city's streets no longer seemed cold or indifferent. The wind was just a whisper, the lights just reflections on wet pavement. He had taken his first steps towards something greater, something that might finally allow him to live, not just for survival, but for his music and the joy it could bring to others. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, competition, criticism, and the fear of losing himself along the way. But he also knew that he had found his path, guided by the music that had always been part of him. With every step, every note, every melody, he was learning who he could be. And for the first time in a long while, he dared to believe that the world might finally listen. The young man's life had changed, but the world outside was still vast, unpredictable, and full of challenges. After the small recital, news of his extraordinary talent began to spread quietly through the city. People whispered about the boy who could make a piano sing in ways that seemed impossible. Yet even as admiration grew, so did the pressure. He had to balance his survival, his training, and now the expectations of those who believed in him. Some mornings, he still walked the streets in worn shoes and a tattered coat, a reminder of how far he had come from the life he once knew. But the streets no longer felt cold or threatening. They felt like a stage, a world that had tested him and prepared him for the next step. Every face he passed, every sound he heard, became part of his music. The city was no longer just a place to survive, it was a canvas for his art. One day, the mentor came with news that made the young man's heart pound. "There's an opportunity," the mentor said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "A private event at a wealthy patron's house. They've heard of you and want to hear you play. It's a chance to reach people who can open doors you've never imagined." The young man felt a mix of fear and anticipation. Performing in a controlled space like a park or a small recital was one thing, but entering a world of wealth, expectation, and scrutiny was something entirely different. Still, he knew he could not shy away. He had come too far to let fear stop him now. The evening of the performance arrived, and the young man felt the familiar flutter of nerves in his stomach. The mansion was enormous, with polished floors, grand chandeliers, and walls adorned with expensive artwork. Guests in fine clothing filled the room, their conversations blending with the soft sounds of silverware against porcelain. He carried himself quietly, aware of the stark contrast between his humble appearance and the elegance around him. Yet he held his head high, letting his fingers rest lightly against the piano keys as if greeting an old friend. When he began to play, the room fell into silence. The music flowed from him naturally, soft and delicate at first, then growing in intensity and emotion. Every note spoke to the hearts of those listening. Some leaned forward, unable to tear their eyes away. Others closed their eyes, lost in the story the young man was telling with each chord. It was not just technical skill that captivated them, it was the soul in his music. The honesty that could not be faked. As he continued, the reactions became more visible. A few guests were visibly moved, some with tears in their eyes. A wealthy businessman whispered to his companion, "I've never heard anything like this. He's extraordinary." Even the host, a stern and reserved figure, could not hide the admiration in his expression. The young man, though aware of their attention, did not let it disturb him. He played as he always had, with heart, with instinct, and with truth, but just as the performance reached a crescendo, something unexpected happened. One of the guests, a seasoned pianist himself, approached with a skeptical look. "Do you truly understand the complexity of this piece?" he asked, his voice edged with doubt. The young man paused for a moment, then nodded respectfully. "I understand it through music, not words," he replied quietly. The challenge hung in the air, and for a moment tension gripped the room. The young man could feel eyes watching, measuring, questioning. He closed his eyes and let the doubt fade, letting his fingers speak instead. He played with even greater precision, his passion blending seamlessly with technique. Every note was deliberate, every pause intentional. By the end of the piece, even the skeptic was silent, a rare smile breaking across his face. He had been convinced, not through argument, but through the undeniable power of the music itself. After the performance, applause filled the room. It was not just polite clapping, it was admiration, respect, and awe. People came forward, shaking his hand, praising his skill, and asking questions about his training and inspiration. For the first time, he realized that his music could open doors not just for himself, but for others, who might follow his path. The young man left the mansion that night with a sense of accomplishment, but also with the weight of responsibility. Recognition brought opportunity, yes, but it also brought expectation. He knew that people would want more performances, more skill, more proof that he was truly a prodigy. The streets he had once roamed freely now felt smaller, the city larger and more complex. Every choice he made would matter, every note he played would be scrutinized. Despite the challenges, he felt a quiet determination growing within him. He returned to the mentor's building, ready to continue training, ready to refine his music even further. The mentor observed him with pride. "You've done well," he said. "But this is only the beginning. Talent alone is not enough. You must keep learning, keep challenging yourself, and never forget the heart that makes your music special." The young man took the words to heart. He practiced long hours, sometimes until the tips of his fingers ached. He experimented with new styles, learning to blend emotion with technique, improvisation with structure. Slowly, he began to master the delicate balance between technical brilliance and heartfelt expression. Each day, his music became richer, more layered. More capable of touching people in ways that went beyond admiration. It moved them, inspired them, and sometimes even changed their perspectives. Yet, fame and opportunity came with complications. Not everyone he met was kind. Some tried to take advantage of his talent, offering promises they could not keep. Others doubted him, questioning whether someone from the streets could truly belong in the world of professional music. Each challenge tested not just his skill, but his patience, humility, and resilience. He learned to navigate these waters carefully, trusting his instincts and the guidance of his mentor. One afternoon, news arrived of a citywide music competition. The event promised exposure, connections, and the possibility of performing on a stage larger than any he had ever imagined. The young man hesitated. Competitions were intimidating, and failure could be public and humiliating. But he knew that staying silent would accomplish nothing. With a deep breath, he decided to enter. Determined to let his music speak for itself once again. In preparation, he poured himself into practice like never before. Each day was a challenge of endurance and focus. He worked on intricate pieces, memorizing every note, every dynamic shift. But he also continued to improvise, allowing his creativity to flourish, making the music his own. The mentor encouraged him, reminding him that while competitions measured skill, true artistry came from authenticity and heart. The day of the competition arrived, and the young man stood backstage, his fingers brushing lightly over the keys of the grand piano. The lights were bright, the audience large, and the atmosphere tense. He could hear murmurs, applause for previous performers, and the hum of excitement in the room. His stomach tightened, but he closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and let the music take over. When he began to play, the audience fell silent. Each note carried emotion and precision, a seamless blend of passion and discipline. The music filled the hall, touching every listener, drawing them into a world created entirely by his talent. He played not to impress, not to win, but to share a piece of his soul. By the end, the audience erupted into applause, some standing, some weeping quietly, all moved beyond words. The judges conferred briefly, then approached him with admiration. "You are extraordinary," one of them said. "Your technique, your emotion, your presence, it is rare to witness such talent." The young man nodded quietly, feeling gratitude, pride, and humility all at once. He had started by playing for survival, for a single meal, and now his music had touched so many lives. As he left the stage, the young man realized that recognition was no longer something to fear. It was a tool, a bridge, and a responsibility. He had the chance to inspire, to change lives, to show that greatness could come from the humblest beginnings. The streets he had once wandered, the struggles he had faced, and the quiet hours of practice had all led him to this moment. And he knew that his journey was far from over. That night, walking through the city once more, he looked at the lights reflecting on the pavement. The people moving through their lives, unaware of the small miracles happening around them. He felt a deep sense of purpose. Music had always been his companion, his refuge, and his voice. Now it was also his gift to the world. And with each note he played in the days to come, he would continue to share that gift, touching hearts, breaking barriers, and leaving an unforgettable mark on everyone who listened. The young man's life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. From wandering the cold streets with empty pockets and a rumbling stomach, he now moved through the city with purpose, carrying a reputation that spread quietly but steadily. People whispered about the boy who could make a piano sing with unmatched emotion. And wherever he went, someone was listening, watching, hoping to catch a glimpse of his gift. Despite the recognition, he remained humble. He never forgot the nights when hunger gnawed at him, the cold alleyways where he had slept, or the empty rooms where he had practiced in silence. Those experiences shaped him, grounding him in a reality that tempered the excitement of opportunity. He had learned that talent alone was not enough. Patience, discipline, and respect for the music were equally important. One morning, a letter arrived. It was an invitation to perform at a prestigious music hall in the city's cultural center, a venue known for hosting world-class musicians. The young man read it slowly, his heart beating fast. The performance promised exposure to influential people in the music world, critics, patrons, and enthusiasts who could open doors to opportunities far beyond anything he had imagined. For a moment, doubt crept in. He remembered the skepticism he had faced in the mansion, the whispered judgments from strangers, and even his own fears about failing in the park. Could he perform on such a stage? Could he meet the expectations of those who had come to believe in him? But then he thought of the music itself, the melodies that had carried him through lonely nights, the rhythms that had comforted him, the songs that had spoken when no one else would listen. With a deep breath, he knew what he had to do. He would play, not for fame, not for approval, but for the music, and through it, for everyone who had ever believed in him or would believe in him one day. The night of the performance arrived, and the hall was grander than anything he had ever seen. The ceilings stretched high, chandeliers glimmered like captured stars, and the polished floors reflected the glow of countless lights. The seats were filled with people dressed elegantly, talking quietly, some scanning the program, others exchanging polite greetings. There was an energy in the air, an anticipation that made the young man's chest tighten. Backstage, he sat quietly at a warm piano bench, fingers hovering over the keys trying to calm the storm inside. His mentor, standing nearby, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Remember why you play," the teacher said softly. "Play for the music, for yourself, and for the people who will feel what you feel. Trust yourself." The young man nodded, closing his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the journey behind him and the possibilities ahead. When it was time, he walked to the grand piano at center stage. The audience quieted, sensing the start of something extraordinary. He lifted his hands and began. The first notes were delicate, almost fragile, yet they carried a warmth and clarity that drew everyone in immediately. Each chord, each pause, was deliberate, conveying a depth of emotion that spoke to every listener. The music was alive, telling stories of struggle, hope, and triumph. Stories he had lived and breathed. As he played, the audience became silent, absorbed in the music. Critics leaned forward, scribbling notes, but even they could not contain their amazement. Patrons and enthusiasts exchanged glances, some with tears forming in the corners of their eyes. The young man did not look at them. He closed his eyes and let the piano carry him, letting the music flow freely, unbound by fear, doubt, or expectation. Midway through the performance, he reached the part of the piece that demanded not just skill but complete surrender. The notes climbed, dipped, and intertwined, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed impossible to contain within the walls of the hall. His fingers moved with precision and instinct, combining everything he had learned with the raw emotion that had always defined him. There was a moment when it felt as if the entire world had stopped time, space, and even breath so that the music could be heard in its purest form. The audience was entranced. Some held their breath, some closed their eyes, and some simply sat motionless, lost in the beauty of what they were witnessing. The young man felt the energy in the room, feeding into him, guiding him, giving life to the music. Every note was a reflection of his journey, every pause a tribute to the struggles he had endured, every crescendo a celebration of the person he had become. When the final note lingered and faded into silence, the hall was still. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then the applause began, soft at first, then building, swelling into a thunderous ovation that shook the room. People stood, clapping, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. Critics whispered in astonishment, patrons smiled with admiration, and musicians who had seen countless performances nodded in genuine respect. The young man rose from the piano, his hands trembling slightly, a smile spreading across his face. He had done it. Not for approval, not for recognition, but for the music itself. And yet, he could feel the impact it had made, the connection, the understanding, the admiration. He had not just played, he had spoken to hearts without using words, and the room had listened. After the performance, several people approached him. Some offered mentorship, others offered invitations to perform in larger venues, and a few even spoke of opportunities to travel and share his music with audiences far beyond the city. The young man listened, polite and calm, absorbing each word with quiet gratitude. He did not let the excitement overwhelm him. Instead, he reflected on how far he had come from playing on the streets for scraps of food to performing on a stage, where every note mattered. As he left the hall that night, walking through the city streets, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The wind was cool against his face, the city lights glimmered, and the streets, once intimidating, now felt welcoming. He had faced doubt, challenge, and fear, and had emerged stronger, not because of recognition, but because he had remained true to himself and his music. In the days that followed, his life continued to change. Invitations poured in, each offering new possibilities, new stages, and new audiences. He traveled to other cities, performed for diverse crowds, and shared the story of a boy who had played for just one meal and had never stopped believing in the power of music. Everywhere he went, people were inspired not just by his skill, but by his humility, perseverance, and authenticity. Yet, despite the fame and opportunities, he remained grounded. He never forgot the streets, the struggles, or the quiet moments when music had been his only companion. He continued to practice diligently, to explore new pieces, to challenge himself, and to push the limits of his talent. The recognition was gratifying, but it was never the goal. The goal was always the music itself, the joy it brought him, and the connection it created with others. One evening, after a performance in a large theater, he walked quietly to a nearby park, the same park where he had been discovered months before. The fountain gleamed under the soft light, and the paths were lined with benches that had once been his stage. He sat down, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, and reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From hunger and cold, from uncertainty and doubt, he had grown, not just as a musician, but as a person. He took out his notebook, filled with scribbles of new compositions and ideas, and began to play on a small portable keyboard he carried. The notes flowed effortlessly, blending lessons learned with intuition, emotion, and imagination. A few people passing by stopped to listen, their faces lighting up with recognition and delight. The young man smiled softly. He realized that the magic was not in the grand halls or prestigious venues, it was in the music itself, in the sharing and the simple joy of touching hearts. And so, his life continued, full of music, discovery, and connection. He played not just to be heard, but to make people feel, to inspire, and to remind them that even from the humblest beginnings, greatness could emerge. The boy who once whispered, "I'll play for just one meal," had become more than a musician. He had become a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the transformative power of following one's passion. In the quiet of the city nights, when the streets were empty and the wind whispered through the alleys, he still walked, still listened, still played. Music remained his companion, his guide, and his voice. And every note he played carried with it a story of struggle and triumph, of humility and strength, of a life lived fully in pursuit of something extraordinary. The journey had started with a simple wish for a meal, but it had become a life defined by purpose, connection, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest acts, like playing a piano for strangers, could create moments that changed the world forever. And as long as he had music in his hands, the world would continue to listen.